Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share stories about obscure cryptids, with this one featuring the Nahual and Sirens. These stories include a boy who was chased by a creature in a cornfield, a Navy sailor who heard something bizarre out on the Mediterranean one night, and a young man who had his life saved by a mysterious creature in the ocean. But first, we start with a story that was emailed to me by a subscriber who shared his father's terrifying encounter with a Nahual. I'd like to thank him for sharing his story with me and allowing me to share it with all of you. In lieu of a personal shout out, he asked that I give a shout out to all the people of the Nuevo Graceros. Alright, let's get into today's stories. A Nahual is a human who has the ability to shapeshift into their tonal animal counterpart. The belief is that one can access power and spiritual insight by connecting with their tonal animal within. The concept of a tonal animal is the belief that a person is born with a close link to an animal. The link between a person and their tonal animal that is associated with indigenous Mesoamerican cultures lasts throughout their lifetimes of both creatures. In English, the word Nahual is often translated as transforming witch, but they are also known as transforming tricksters and shapeshifters. They normally transform at night, usually into a dog, owl, bat, wolf, or turkey. They drink blood from their human victims, steal property, and cause disease, amongst other things. The subscriber who emailed me his father's story says Nahual are essentially a Mexican skinwalker. The first story of this episode is the previously mentioned story emailed in from a subscriber where his father, who we will call Ishmael, and his friend Vicente encountered a Nahual one night. Both names were changed for privacy reasons. Their story comes to us from Durango, Mexico. Durango is the largest city in and the capital of the Mexican state of Durango. It has a population of 616,068 as of the 2020 census and is named in honor of the first president of Mexico, Victoria de Durango. Ishmael and his family lived in the southern part of the city where his family is from. The Chichimecas are the native people of the area. Ishmael worked as a rancher, and our story picks up on the night he forgot to get the cows in due to him being at the village fair. Ishmael and Vicente headed out to the ranch at around 9 p.m. on that fateful evening. A time of night that may not seem very dark in a big American city, but in the depths of the Durango forest, it was as black as night. Armed with pistols and hunting rifles as a precaution against any ill-intentioned individuals, Ishmael and Vicente drove the 10 minutes until they reached the cows. Once rounded up, they safely secured them in a barn-like structure where a massive dog named Tiburon stood guard. On their way back home, they encountered a lone, larger-than-normal coyote, which is a peculiar sight considering coyotes are typically pack animals. However, rumors of a Nahual had been circulating ever since the neighbors from another nearby ranch shared a chilling tale with Ishmael's father about a skinned lamb. Gripping their weapons tightly, Ishmael and Vicente made their way toward the garage, which was located a little distance from the village. As they reached the garage, they quickly went inside and locked it up. However, when they looked outside, they saw the coyote. They readied their firearms by cocking them and aiming them at the door. That's when the coyote approached the door and began scratching at it. In that moment, Ishmael decided that they were taking the ranch truck home whether his father got mad about it or not. That's when the coyote started slamming itself into the door. Ishmael and Vicente got into the truck, started it up, and unlocked the garage door, ready to ram through it. The door the coyote was attacking began to loosen, but Vicente was ready and fired 2 rounds through it. A piercing howl filled the air, causing Vicente to jump into the bed of the truck. Ishmael then believed he heard the coyote retreating into the night. He told Vicente to grab the rifle and be ready to shoot while he opened the garage door. He got the truck outside before closing and locking the garage from the outside while Vicente stood watch. Ishmael then told Vicente to quit acting foolish and get in the truck instead of riding in the bed. They were both still quite shaken when they were making their way back to town. Wanting to remain in a crowd, they headed for the fair, which was still in full swing, and didn't leave until it began to wind down. Once back home, they remained on high alert, not sleeping, with their firearms at the ready. They did not return to the ranch to let the cows out for 2 days due to fear. Fortunately, the cows had plenty of hay, and the dogs still had leftover meat from the cows and goats. Ishmael ended up selling the land and purchasing new land closer to town. He and his family never returned to the old land, even during their trips to Mexico. When different cultures have stories of similar creatures as well as legend and folklore to go along with it, it just adds legitimacy for me. I've often said that legend and lore have to be based on something, and who's to say it isn't based on truth? Now we all know how stories get changed when passed down through the generations, altered here and there, but it has to be based on something. It would be easy to discount or dismiss something as made up when only one group has a story about it. But when multiple cultures have stories about creatures so similar as the Nahual and skinwalkers, it makes me believe there is something to it. And in this story we have the Nahual, which was described to me as a Mexican skinwalker that has similar characteristics and behaviors as the Navajo legend. If the practice of harnessing dark arts to turn oneself into a shapeshifter exists, then it very well could have been discovered in Mexico and used there as well. It would certainly seem that's the case in this story, and also in our next one. What a terrifying ordeal it must have been to not only see this larger than normal coyote, but for it to follow them and then to try to smash down the door as well. This is definitely uncharacteristic of a coyote. I would have been firing rounds into the door too. Luckily it worked and they drove this thing away. However, I was fully expecting it to show back up while they were trying to get the truck out of the garage. But luckily it didn't, and they were able to make it back to the city safely. I don't blame Ishmael in the slightest for not wanting to go back out to the ranch for a few days or for selling it and buying land closer to town. I wouldn't want to go back out there where I had such a harrowing incident either, especially with what I believe to be a supernatural creature such as this. I've often spoken on the topic of whether cryptids are physical or supernatural beings, and this story points to this particular one, as well as skinwalkers, being a bit of both. I would also like to include that the dog is still alive today, has been retired as a work dog, and is living out his days as a companion for Ishmael's father. What do you think of this story? And what would you do if something like this was trying to smash down the door to get to you? The next story comes from a poster who shares what happened to his grandfather when he was unlucky enough to cross paths with a Nahual. His encounter took place in the hillsides near the Mexican municipality Huixquilocan back in the 1960s. Huixquilocan is located on the west side of Mexico City and is part of Greater Mexico City. However, it is independent of the city itself. It has a population of 242,167 as of the 2010 census. The story was brought to light when the family was having a conversation about supernatural occurrences and encounters with strange creatures. The OP notes that they are a Christian family and take this story to be the truth. The story is a second-hand telling told by the OP's mother, who heard the story from his grandfather many years before. Back in the 60s, the area where they lived was very rural, and they only had a few neighbors. Since his family didn't have much money, he would help take care of the neighbors' cattle on the property located up the hill from where he lived to earn some extra cash. Usually, his neighbor would join him in rounding up the cattle at sunset to bring them back to the barn. But one day, his neighbor fell ill and was unable to join him. So he ventured out by himself, which wasn't out of the ordinary due to the trust they had in him, and he started herding the cattle. It was close to sunset when he got them back to the stables and was counting them. He realized that one was missing. As he retraced his steps, he made his way down the hill, but he froze upon hearing the sound of rustling and snapping coming from the dry cornfields. Believing it was the cow, he called out to it. However, what emerged from that cornfield was not the cow, but instead a massive black dog. The sight of the creature filled him with an intense feeling of dread. Without wasting a second, he turned and sprinted back up the hill, screaming as loud as he could. When he glanced back, he was horrified to see the dog, now running on two legs, chasing after him. Thankfully, his neighbor, alerted by his screams, swiftly opened the door and let him in. The OP says he isn't quite sure what happened next, except for the fact that his grandfather shared the incident with his neighbor and family, resulting in his parents forbidding him to return to tend to the cattle there. One intriguing aspect of this story, according to the OP, was how vividly his grandfather described witnessing the dog transforming into a bipedal creature before chasing after him. Once the story was finished, the family could not recall the name of the creature that was straight out of folklore. The transformation detail caught the OP's attention, so he showed his mother images of a dogman and a skinwalker. She pointed out that the description provided by his grandfather aligned more closely with a skinwalker. It was then that his father remembered the name and informed everyone that they are referred to Nahuals in Mexico. He ends his post by sharing his findings while researching these creatures. He says he discovered fascinating similarities between Native American and Mexican folklore surrounding these beings. These shape-shifting shamans have the ability to morph into animals, particularly large dogs. What's intriguing is that they are not viewed as mere myth or fantastical beings, but rather a reality that is widely known in their region. There have been other peculiar occurrences on the same property where his grandfather had his encounter, although the specifics remain unknown to him. When I first read this story, I thought this was a dogman, and a strong case could be made for that. But the part about him vividly describing this thing transforming is what made me think it could have been a Nahual instead. I will say that dogman sightings have been reported all over the world, and to an 8-year-old seeing a 4-legged creature go up onto 2 legs, it could have seemed that it was transforming, so this very well could have been a dogman. But after learning about the Nahual, it's hard to say for sure. But given the legend and lore surrounding this cryptid and the fact that there are so many sightings in that area, especially on that property, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. He and his family would know better than I would anyway. What do you think about this one? Was the boy chased by a Nahual or a dogman? In Greek mythology, sirens were dangerous creatures of the sea who would lure ships into rocks by singing, causing the vessels to wreck. It's said that sailors are unable to resist these songs and are drawn to them as if hypnotized and powerless to resist. While these creatures were thought to be purely fictional, there has been an increase in sightings in recent years, with one video in particular going viral on the internet. I believe the internet has been a catalyst in the rising number of stories for every type of cryptid. However, not in the number of sightings. I don't think that has ever changed. What has changed though is that there is now a platform for people all over the world to post their stories online. There have been a number of siren stories popping up lately and a number of videos making their way around online. I will admit that most of the videos look extremely fake, but there are a few that caught my attention and do look legit. Then there are some stories I see online that take place decades ago, just like with other cryptids. Being that they are similar to cryptids, I wanted to include them on this channel with a couple of stories I found. The first siren story comes from a poster who was in the Navy at the time of his encounter, which took place back in 2020. He had been deployed and was at sea for 8 months. Being that it was at the beginning of the pandemic, they couldn't dock at any ports, so they were forced to spend all of their time at sea. They were on their way home, crossing the Mediterranean somewhere between Greece and Italy. The original poster had gone out to have a smoke in what he calls the pit. Out there with him was another sailor he didn't know. However, he could tell he was part of the air division due to his distinctive green shirt. As he faced the outside of the pit, toward the walkway and a closed door that was both water and airtight sealed, enjoying his smoke break, he heard a harmonizing, melodious voice suddenly fill the air out over the water. He knew it wasn't the man in the pit with him because he was a very big man with a deep voice. Plus, he confirmed hearing the singing too. Intrigued, they both felt an inexplicable urge to peer out into the water, but they couldn't spot anything. However, they did hear the distinct sound of splashing, almost as if someone was swimming out in the sea. It was well past midnight, and he couldn't help wonder if he had heard a siren that night. He ends by saying the incident has become one of his favorite tales to share when reminiscing about his time in service. This isn't the first time I've heard someone from the Navy talk about hearing some weird things at night while out on the ocean. And it isn't just sailors from the Navy either. Another one I hear a lot about are fishing vessels where people on them have similar encounters to this one. It would be one thing if only the OP heard the singing and splashing as if someone was swimming, but the other men there with him confirm hearing both of these things as well. And the fact that it made them want to go look out into the water? Perhaps there really is a draw to the singing of a siren that we can't resist. What do you think he heard that night on the Mediterranean? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who is convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that merpeople, as he calls them, exist due to an experience he had when he was a child. His mother told him the story while reminiscing about his childhood, and he took to the internet to share his tale. He says he wanted to share it due to a rise in these types of stories as well as those about Fae. I will say that this may not be a siren story, but it is related, being that sirens are often depicted as appearing similar to a mermaid. When he was 7 years old, he had a terrifying experience at Galveston Beach in Texas, where he almost drowned. According to his mother, he got caught in a riptide and was being pulled out to sea by the powerful current. But just as it seemed as though he was lost, a mysterious figure appeared out of nowhere, swam directly against the current toward him, and brought him back to the safety of the shallow water. His mother insists that the savior was gray, bald, and had very large bulbous eyes. Before vanishing, she locked gazes with it as it left her son to run to her. According to his mother, the first words out of his mouth were, quote, "He's going to tell his family about us." But this wasn't his only time hearing about merpeople, as there was another story he heard when he was at a nursing home visiting his great-grandmother. As he was looking for her, he randomly came across an elderly lady who claimed to have been present at the Hartford Circus fire of 1944. According to her, the Ringling Brothers had a special attraction that day, one that nobody ever talks about. Now, he does say that he couldn't help but question the authenticity of her tale, considering her age, but what she told him next was truly astonishing. The elderly lady told him that the special attraction was a live mermaid, housed in an enormous glass tank. At first, he dismissed her story as pure nonsense, that is, until she described the mermaid, which perfectly matched the one his mother described the day that he almost drowned. The only difference was that this mermaid had no arms, only powerful fins resembling that of a dolphin. The old lady painted a vivid picture of the creature, claiming that it was in a state of complete and utter misery in the tank. When the big top burned, she didn't hear anything else about it and assumed the poor thing, as she calls it, died in the fire. He ends by saying that two accounts describing nearly the same exact type of creature mixed with the rise of sightings nowadays, with people hearing sirens, has him wanting to ask if anyone believes these creatures actually exist. In the comment section of this story, one user says he knows someone who is friends with a submariner who has found crude hunting tools such as spears and the like underwater in the ocean. They do say that it could all be untrue, but it does make them wonder. It certainly makes me wonder as well. I mentioned before that I have been seeing more accounts of sirens and mermaids on the rise in recent years, especially one compelling video of a young man on a fishing boat at night who walks out onto the deck and hears singing and yelling. Near the end of the video, you can hear a voice seemingly say, "Jump for me." It really makes you wonder what could be out there in the ocean that we don't know about. So much of the oceans have been unexplored, so there really is no telling. Perhaps these creatures do exist. As far as these stories go, when I heard the one about the Ringling brothers having a mermaid in a tank, I almost completely dismissed that part of the story. However, when he said what the elderly lady described was almost the exact same as what his mother described, other than this thing having fins instead of arms, it drew me back in. There's no way that woman could have known what the OP's mother described to him and repeated it back to him verbatim. One thing that adds legitimacy to cryptid stories for me is how everyone from all over the world who has these encounters describes either the beings or the circumstances surrounding them. For example, how they feel like they are being watched, feelings of dread, or the conditions in which these creatures appear the same way over and over. Now, a small group could all get together and make up the same story with the same creature and keep it straight. But for people all over the world to post their stories online and have the same feelings while seeing creatures with the same physical characteristics and behaviors would be near impossible. What his mother saw that day made a lasting impression on her, and she can still vividly see the creature that saved her son's life. The shock of seeing something straight out of fiction coupled with the fact that it just saved her son would leave that kind of impression on anyone. What do you think about this one? And what are your thoughts on the existence of sirens and/or mermaids? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.